Welcome to the Haven Collective. I'm J.R. Foresteros, and this is the Beacon Bin. This is the first week that we're going to be studying the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector that you can find in Luke chapter 18, beginning of verse 9. If you have not read that parable, or even if you have read it, you should probably read it again before we talk about it in the Beacon Bin. You can find a link in the video description below, or if you already have a Bible, you probably can find Luke 18. This is a story that has become pretty common and popular, and it asks the question, who do you give the benefit of the doubt to? If you're like me, I give myself the benefit of the doubt all the time. I'm less good at extending the benefit of the doubt to someone else. So for instance, if I cut someone off in traffic, it's because maybe I was distracted by an important conversation, or maybe I just have somewhere I really need to be in and it's an emergency, and if they only knew what position I was in, they probably wouldn't have honked at me. Of course, when someone else cuts me off, they're an evil person who should have their driver's license revoked and probably rot in prison for the rest of their life, right? Like I said, I extend the benefit of the doubt to myself. I'm much worse at doing it for other people. Well, in this parable, a Methodist scholar named J. Ellsworth Callis asks us to consider that maybe what Jesus is asking us to do with this parable is extend the benefit of the doubt not just to me or to people like me, but to everyone. And Jesus does this through this story about a Pharisee and a tax collector. Now, mostly because we have 2,000 years of interpretive history, we think of the Pharisee as the bad guy. That's because they're often Jesus's opponents in the Gospels. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that we'll talk about over the next few weeks. But really what it comes down to is that Jesus and the Pharisees were the most similar. Their interpretations of Scripture were the most similar. And you actually tend to disagree most sharply with the people that you have the most in common with, because they almost get it. It's not like those crazy people that are just completely wrong, right? So in the Gospels, Jesus and the Pharisees are often loggerheads, and that's created this interpretive tradition where we look at Pharisees as legalists and as villains and as all these things that just aren't true about Pharisees in general. And on the other hand, we've been used to heroic tax collectors in the Gospel. So Matthew was a tax collector. Zacchaeus, the wee little man who climbed the tree, was a tax collector. We have all of these stories in the New Testament of tax collectors coming to faith in Jesus and amazing everybody. So we've sort of learned to think of them as good guys. So when we come to the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, we think, yes, the Pharisee's the bad guy and the tax collector's the good guy. The problem is that that's not how Jesus' original audience would have heard the parable. For them, Pharisees were fine and upstanding people. They were maybe a little bit better than everyone else, a little bit holier than everyone else. It's honestly how a lot of people, particularly in Texas, still look at pastors. Now, again, I know that because of all of the things that pastors have rightfully been called out for, it's a little more complicated. But if you think back like 20 or 30 years, someone said they were a pastor, they have automatic prestige and standing, and people just thought, they're like a little bit better than everybody else. And not really in a bad way, right? They were aspirational, right? They were who everyone should strive to be. That's how Jesus' audience thought of Pharisees. They weren't mustache-twirling villains. They were good guys, people who were actually a little bit better than everyone else. Tax collectors, on the other hand, were villains. They were Jewish people who worked for Rome collecting taxes from their own people. They were like traitors. They were working with the occupying army, taking money from God's people and giving it to the pagans. They were rightly regarded as truly villainous. So when Jesus' original audience heard this setup, a Pharisee comes into the temple and prays this prayer that he says, hey, God, thank you for making me such a holy person. They would not have seen that as arrogant or entitled. They would have said, well, yeah, he's right. Like, God did make him a really good person, and it's pretty cool. And meantime, the Pharisee, or the tax collector, who's over there beating his breast and not even standing with the rest of the community and saying, I'm a wicked sinner, they're like, yeah, he is. And in fact, if I saw him at the temple, I'd probably try to get as far away from him as possible. Because no one likes a tax collector. No one wants to be associated with them, right? They don't want to get that traitorous stench all over them. So the shock of the parable is when Jesus says that both of these men leave the temple justified. Both of them leave in right standing with God. The Pharisee isn't somehow in a better position than the tax collector. And I want to read a quote from Dr. Callis that he writes about this. He says the root of the problem for good people like us who probably identify with the Pharisee, we imagine ourselves to be good. We give ourselves the benefit of the doubt when we mess up, right? So the root of the problem for good people is not simply that they have a holier than God attitude. They condemn in judgment those God does not, and they refuse to give room to the grace of God for others because they don't believe they deserve it, like that tax collector, right? And for themselves because they don't believe they need it. When we are a person who rushes to judgment instead of extending grace, what I've been calling the benefit of the doubt, we don't leave room for grace, right? We don't leave room for other people because we say they don't deserve it. And we don't leave room for ourselves because we think we don't need it, right? It was just a little misunderstanding or a little slip up. And, I'm mostly a good person. But what Jesus says in the parable is that we all equally are in need of grace. Both the super holy people who are legitimately good people and the really awful people. We all are equally in need of grace. Now, I hope this parable generates some really provocative discussion for us. I know it's been doing a lot for me. And so this week in our Beacons, we're going to be talking about Dr. Callis's interpretation of the parable. I look forward to that. But until then, grace and peace be with you.